Most men worth $2 billion don't barge into a woman's hotel room at 10 o'clock at night. And if they do, they definitely don't stop talking mid-sentence and forget why they came. But that's exactly what happened to Gabriel Maddox. See, 3 hours before he pushed open that door, Gabriel was on a private jet burning a hole through the sky, rehearsing every word he was going to say to the woman on the other side. He was furious. The kind of furious where your hands shake and your voice drops to a whisper because yelling isn't enough. A deal worth 3 years of his life had just collapsed. And it was her strategy his own team had ignored. But when he walked into that room, he didn't say a single word about the deal. Because what he saw sitting in that armchair, in the dim light, holding a 5-week-old baby nobody knew existed, changed everything. Now, before we get to what happened inside that room, and trust me, what happened inside that room will rearrange something in your chest, I need to take you back. Because Gabriel Maddox didn't become the kind of man who barges through doors overnight. That took years. And a woman named Lorraine. Lorraine Maddox raised 2 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southeast DC on a salary that most people would call impossible. She cleaned office buildings from 11 at night until 5 in the morning. Came home, slept for 3 hours, then got up and baked pound cakes that she sold to churches, hair salons, and the front desk ladies at every medical office within a 10-block radius. That woman had hands that smelled like bleach and buttercream at the same time. Gabriel remembers that. It's one of those details that never leaves you, you know? The smell of someone who loves you more than they love sleep. Lorraine had this notebook, composition notebook, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore for 99 cents. And every time she found a magazine in one of those office lobbies she cleaned, she'd tear out the pages of beautiful places. Hotels in Vermont, inns on the coast of Maine, cottages in the English countryside. She'd paste them into that notebook with a glue stick and write 2 words underneath each picture. Someday places. She never went to any of them. Not a single one. But she made sure her son would. Lorraine scraped together every dollar she could and put Gabriel through private school. Not because she cared about prestige. Because she knew what a zip code could do to a kid's future in this country. And she wasn't about to let hers get swallowed by the wrong one. Gabriel was smart. Scary smart. The kind of kid who read the Wall Street Journal at 14 and understood it. By 22, he had a degree in finance. By 25, he was working at one of the biggest private equity firms in Manhattan, learning how money really moves when nobody's watching. And then at 27, he did what he'd been building toward his entire life. He launched his own fund, Maddox Capital Holdings. The first close was $180 million. That's the kind of number that changes the temperature in a room when you say it. But here's the thing about that number. And this is the part that'll sit with you. Lorraine died 3 months before the fund closed. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't negotiate. She was diagnosed in September and gone by December. Gabriel was in the middle of fundraising meetings, flying between New York and London, shaking hands with people who would never understand what that money actually meant to him. He made it home for the last 11 days. Sat beside her bed in that same 2-bedroom apartment, listening to her breathe. She could barely talk by then, but one night, around 2 in the morning, she opened her eyes and looked at him with this expression that he has never been able to describe to another human being. She said, "You're going to do big things, baby. Just don't do them alone." She was gone 4 days later. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second. Because everything Gabriel Maddox became after that moment, every deal, every billion, every wall he built around himself, it all traces back to that apartment. To the woman who never got to see the empire her pound cakes paid for. Gabriel carried the guilt of that like a stone lodged in his chest. He didn't talk about it. Didn't go to therapy. Didn't slow down. He did the opposite. He worked harder, faster, colder. Because if he stopped moving, if he let the silence catch up with him, he'd have to sit with the fact that he built a life his mother would have been proud of, and she wasn't here to see it. By 36, Gabriel Maddox was worth north of $2 billion. He had offices in 3 cities. He wore custom suits that cost more than his mother's annual rent used to be, and he carried himself like a man who had already decided that letting people in was a risk the numbers didn't justify. He dated, sure, Beautiful women, smart women, women who understood the arrangement. Dinner, conversation, maybe a weekend somewhere expensive. But it was always temporary and always on his terms. No one got past the lobby. That was the rule. The one exception was his sister, Yolanda. 29, sharp-tongued, ran the philanthropic side of the Maddox portfolio, and possessed the only voice on the planet that could make Gabriel Maddox shut up and listen. Yolanda had been telling her brother for years that he was building a skyscraper with no foundation. "You've got money, Gabe," she told him once over dinner. "What you don't have is a single person who'd notice if you disappeared tomorrow. That's not success. That's a really expensive kind of lonely." He changed the subject. He always changed the subject. But then the Linden deal happened, and something inside Gabriel shifted in a way he didn't expect. The Linden Collection. 5 boutique hotels scattered across New England, each one more beautiful than the last. A crumbling inn on the coast of Maine that literary legends once stayed in. A converted textile mill in Vermont that travel magazines had called the most beautiful small hotel in America. A restored sea captain's house in Marblehead, Massachusetts, perched on a cliff above the Atlantic like it was daring the ocean to take it. These weren't chain hotels. They weren't glass towers with identical lobbies and the same playlist in every elevator. These were places with stories built into the walls. The kind of properties that remembered who slept there and whispered about it after they left. And they were dying. The family trust that owned them, the Pembertons, had been mismanaging the collection for a decade. Deferred maintenance. Bad leadership hires. A marketing strategy stuck somewhere around 2007. The patriarch, Howard Pemberton, 78 years old and stubborn as January in New England, still controlled the trust. But his health was failing and his children were circling, and the hotels were bleeding money faster than nostalgia could keep them alive. Gabriel saw the numbers first. Any good investor would. The turnaround model was extraordinary once you cleaned up the operations and repositioned the brand. But it wasn't the numbers that kept him up at night. It was the notebook. When Gabriel first visited the Marblehead property for due diligence, he stood in the lobby and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't name it right away. But later, on the flight back to New York, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos until he found it. A picture of his mother's composition notebook, one of the few things he'd kept from the apartment. And there, on the 3rd page, was a magazine clipping of a coastal New England inn with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. It could have been the Marblehead property's twin. Gabriel Maddox didn't believe in signs. He believed in spreadsheets. But that night, he called his acquisitions team and said 4 words that meant the Linden deal wasn't just another play. "We're not losing this." There was one problem. Howard Pemberton wouldn't sell to just anyone. The old man had rejected 3 serious buyers already because he could smell the flip from a mile away. He didn't want someone who'd gut the properties, slap a trendy name on them, and turn them into influencer backdrops. He wanted a buyer who understood what the hotels meant, who'd preserve their character while making them financially viable. Gabriel needed a brand strategy so good it would make a 78-year-old man with trust issues hand over his life's work. Not a PowerPoint, not a pitch deck full of charts. A story, a vision, something that proved Gabriel saw these places the way Howard did, not as assets but as living things. He needed the best brand strategist in luxury hospitality. His team brought him names. Every one of them competent. Every one of them forgettable. Gabriel sat through presentations that were polished and professional and utterly soulless. Nobody got it. Nobody understood that this wasn't about occupancy rates and RevPAR metrics. This was about making an old man believe that his legacy would be safe. And then Yolanda said a name. "What about Phoebe Callaway?" The room went quiet. Dale Whitfield, Gabriel's COO, a man with a sharp jaw and sharper elbows who had been with the firm since year 2, shut it down immediately. "She's radioactive," Dale said, leaning back in his chair like the conversation was already over. "The Harcourt scandal. You attach her name to this pitch and Pemberton's lawyers will use it to bury us before we get through the lobby." Yolanda didn't back down. She was cleared, Dale. Fully cleared. The investigation didn't find a single thread connecting her to the fraud. She lost her career because people found it easier to associate than investigate. Dale shook his head. Cleared doesn't matter. Perception matters. And her perception is poison. Gabriel hadn't said a word. He was doing what he always did in these moments. Listening. Calculating. Running scenarios in his head like a man playing chess against himself. After the meeting, he went back to his office, closed the door, and pulled Phoebe Calloway's file. What he found kept him at his desk for 3 hours. He read the brand campaigns she'd built at Harcourt before the scandal. The repositioning of one property that tripled bookings in 18 months. A loyalty program overhaul so effective that Harvard Business School turned it into a case study. He found a recorded keynote she'd given at a hospitality conference in Lisbon and watched the whole thing twice. There was something about the way she spoke. Precise but warm. Confident but not performing. She didn't talk about brands like they were products. She talked about them like they were promises. And she made you believe that a well-kept promise could be the most profitable thing in the world. Gabriel picked up the phone and dialed her directly. She almost didn't answer. Phoebe Calloway hadn't gotten a call from anyone in the industry in over a year. When she saw the caller ID and realized who it was, her first instinct was suspicion. Because men like Gabriel Maddox didn't call women like her, women the industry had thrown away, unless they wanted something they could get cheap. But Gabriel was blunt. No small talk. No flattery. Just the question. I don't care about the Harcourt situation. I've read the investigation report. You were clean. What I care about is whether you can build a brand narrative compelling enough to convince a 78-year-old man to trust me with his legacy. Can you do that? Phoebe was quiet for 10 seconds. Then, in a voice that was steady and sure and carried the weight of a woman who had been waiting in the dark for a very long time for someone to turn the light back on, she said, "Yes, I can do that." What Gabriel didn't know, what he couldn't have known from a phone call and a resume, was that when Phoebe Calloway said yes to his offer, she was hiding something. Not a scandal. Not a lie. Something far more complicated. Something with a heartbeat. Phoebe Calloway was not the kind of woman who ended up invisible. That's what made what happened to her so cruel. At 30 years old, she had already done more in the luxury hospitality world than most people manage in an entire career. She spoke 3 languages. She could walk into a room full of executives twice her age and, within 15 minutes, have every single one of them leaning forward in their chairs, hanging on whatever she was about to say next. She didn't do it with volume. She didn't do it with flash. Phoebe had this way of seeing what a brand actually was underneath the logo and the tagline and the mood boards. She saw the promise. The thing a guest was really buying when they booked a room, not square footage, not thread count, but the feeling of being somewhere that understood them. That gift made her one of the most valuable people at Harcourt Luxury Group by the time she was 28. VP of Brand Strategy. The youngest person to ever hold that title at the company. And if you'd asked anyone in the industry back then who was going to run Harcourt someday, 9 out of 10 would have said Phoebe Calloway without blinking. But that was before Marcus Webb. Marcus was the CFO. Tall. Polished. The kind of man who could make a quarterly earnings call sound like poetry. He had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and he deployed it like a weapon. Phoebe met him at a company retreat in the Berkshires. He asked her a question about brand positioning that was smart enough to prove he'd actually read her work, and something about that, a man who paid attention, who listened, who treated her mind like it mattered. She let her guard down. First time in years. They dated quietly at first. Office relationships are complicated, especially at the executive level. But within 6 months, the quiet part was over. They were the golden couple. Industry galas. Magazine profiles. The man and woman who were going to lead Harcourt into its next chapter together. Marcus proposed on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen of her apartment, with a ring he'd had designed to match a bracelet her late mother used to wear. Phoebe's mother had died when Phoebe was 19, ovarian cancer, and losing her had left a hole that Phoebe filled with work and discipline and the quiet belief that she could survive anything as long as she kept moving. Marcus knew that about her. He knew all the soft spots, and she thought, foolishly, stupidly, in a way she would punish herself for 1,000 times after. She thought that meant he was safe. The engagement lasted 2 years. 2 years of planning a wedding. 2 years of building a shared future. 2 years during which Marcus Webb was systematically stealing from the company they both worked for. He'd set up a network of shell accounts, funneled $6.2 million out of Harcourt over 14 months. The money went into a private venture that Phoebe knew nothing about. When the board's internal audit caught the discrepancies, everything unraveled in 72 hours. Phoebe found out on a Wednesday morning. She was in her office reviewing a campaign brief when her phone rang. It was the board chair. His voice was careful, measured, the way people talk when they know the next sentence is going to rearrange your life. She drove home in a daze, walked into the apartment she shared with Marcus and found it half empty. His closet, his desk, his side of the bathroom, gone. No note, no explanation, just absence. He'd fled the country, took the money, and a junior analyst named Tessa, a 24-year-old woman who Phoebe had personally mentored, brought her into meetings, advocated for her promotion, taught her how to build a brand deck from scratch. Now try to imagine that. The man you were going to marry steals millions from the company you both dedicated your careers to, disappears without a word. And the person he disappears with is someone you took under your wing, someone you believed in, someone you helped. That's not just betrayal. That's a 3-car pileup of betrayal. The professional, the romantic, and the personal all crashing into each other at the same time. Phoebe was investigated, of course, pulled into rooms with lawyers and forensic accountants, her emails searched, her finances dissected. For 6 weeks, she lived under a microscope while strangers decided whether she was a criminal or a fool. They cleared her, completely. No connection to the fraud whatsoever. But it didn't matter. Here's something people don't tell you about scandals. The investigation is supposed to find the truth. And it does. But the truth doesn't travel as fast as the story. The story had already been written by the time the investigation closed, and in that story, Phoebe Calloway was either complicit or incompetent. Either she helped Marcus steal, or she was too blind to see what was happening right in front of her. Neither version left room for the actual Phoebe, the one who had been deceived by someone she loved, the one who had done nothing wrong. Doors closed, calls stopped being returned. Recruiters who used to pursue her pretended they'd never heard her name. An entire industry she had given a decade of her life to looked at her and saw contaminated evidence. She cleared out her office on a Friday afternoon, carried 1 box to her car, sat in the parking garage for 45 minutes with the engine running, staring at the concrete wall in front of her, trying to figure out how a life this carefully built could collapse this completely. And then, 2 days later, sitting in the bathroom of her empty apartment at 6 in the morning, she looked down at a pregnancy test and watched 2 lines appear. 8 weeks. Marcus's child. Growing inside her while the wreckage of his betrayal was still smoldering. I want to pause here, because this is a moment that could go a lot of different ways, right? Some women would have called Marcus. Some would have panicked. Some would have made a decision quickly one way or the other and moved on. Phoebe did none of those things. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time. She put her hand on her stomach. And she made a decision that was both the simplest and the hardest one she'd ever made. She was keeping this baby. And Marcus Webb would never know. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she was trying to punish him. But because she refused to tie her child to a man who was capable of what Marcus had done. This baby deserved a clean start. Even if that start was terrifying. Even if it meant doing everything alone. Phoebe moved out of Manhattan within the month. Found a small rented cottage in Cold Spring, a quiet village about an hour north of the city, right on the Hudson River. The kind of place where people wave from their porches and nobody asks too many questions. She lived off savings. Did freelance consulting under a different name, helping small businesses with brand strategy for a fraction of what she used to charge. She went to prenatal appointments alone. Assembled a crib alone. Lay awake at 3 in the morning listening to the silence of that cottage and wondering if she had made the right choice. And then Gabriel Maddox called. When she picked up that phone and heard his offer, everything inside her went to war. Hope versus fear. Opportunity versus exposure. The chance to rebuild her career versus the risk of losing it all over again. Because there was a problem Gabriel didn't know about. Phoebe was 5 months pregnant. She said yes anyway, because the alternative was watching the last window of her professional life close while she stood on the wrong side of the glass. She moved into the suite at the Linden's flagship property in Marblehead in January, wore structured blazers, long coats, positioned herself behind desks and conference tables during video calls. She leaned into the natural assumption that she was simply a woman who carried herself with authority, and nobody looked twice. For 2 months, she worked 16-hour days, studied every property in the collection, walked the halls of the Marblehead Hotel at midnight, touching the walls, reading the guest books that went back decades. She interviewed former staff, pulled county records on the original construction, dug into the Pemberton family history like an archaeologist who understood that the story of a place is never just about the building. The result was a 120-page brand Bible, not a corporate document, a love letter, a vision for what the Linden collection could become if someone gave it both money and meaning. It was the best work Phoebe had ever done, and she knew it. When Gabriel flew to Marblehead in March to review her progress, Phoebe was 7 months pregnant. She wore a long wool coat and was already seated behind the conference table when he walked in. He didn't notice. He was too busy being stunned by the work. He left that meeting believing the Linden deal was finally possible. Phoebe left that meeting and threw up in the bathroom from the stress of holding everything together. Micah came in early April, born at the small hospital in Salem, 12 minutes away from the hotel. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, auburn fuzz on his head, his mother's freckles already hinting across his nose. Phoebe held him in the recovery room and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since the day Marcus disappeared. But these weren't grief tears. These were something else entirely. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The recognition that for the first time in over a year, she was holding something in her arms that hadn't been taken from her. She took 10 days off, told Gabriel's office it was a family emergency. Then she was back at her laptop with a newborn sleeping in a bassinet 2 feet away. She hired June Hargrove, a retired nurse from the town, 63 years old, gray hair, no-nonsense hands, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made chaos feel embarrassed of itself. June came every morning at 7 and stayed until 6. She held Micah while Phoebe took calls. She walked him in the garden while Phoebe revised pitch decks. She made soup and left it on the stove without being asked. And when Phoebe apologized once for needing so much help, June looked at her over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Honey, asking for help isn't weakness. It's math. You've only got 2 hands and this baby needs 4. For 5 weeks, Phoebe held it together, nursing at 2 in the morning, working at 4, napping when Micah napped, which was never long enough. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles took up permanent residence under her eyes. But the work never slipped. Every deliverable on time. Every strategy document sharp. Every email to Gabriel measured, professional, precise. She was running on fumes and willpower, and the wire she was walking was getting thinner every day. Now here's what I want you to think about. Phoebe has a 5-week-old baby. She hasn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in over a month. She's one mistake away from losing the only professional opportunity she's had in over a year. And the man who hired her has no idea any of this is happening. If you were Phoebe, do you tell him? Do you risk everything by being honest? Do you call Gabriel Maddox and say, "By the way, I had a baby and I've been doing all of this on no sleep with a newborn in the next room"? Or do you keep your head down, deliver the work, and pray the wire holds? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what actually happens next is neither of those things. 3 weeks before the final pitch to Howard Pemberton, the deal hit a wall. Not from the outside, from the inside. Pemberton's eldest son, Clifton, 52 years old and territorial as a junkyard dog, had been quietly sabotaging Gabriel's bid for months. Clifton didn't want to sell. He wanted to keep control of the trust, keep drawing his management fees, keep pretending the hotels weren't falling apart on his watch. He'd been feeding confidential information to the other buyers, playing them against Gabriel, trying to create enough chaos that his father would give up on selling altogether. Phoebe had identified Clifton as the problem weeks ago. She built a sub-strategy specifically designed to neutralize him. A preservation covenant that guaranteed the hotel's historical character would be maintained. A board advisory seat that let Clifton keep his name on the letterhead. A naming rights clause that made it look like he was gaining influence, not losing it. She sent the document to Gabriel's team with a note that was crystal clear. Present the preservation covenant first. Lead with legacy. Make Clifton feel like a partner, not a casualty. Do not, under any circumstances, open with financials. Dale Whitfield read the document. Then he threw it in the trash. Dale walked into the meeting with Clifton Pemberton and led with exactly what Phoebe told him not to. Acquisition price. Projected returns. Restructuring timeline. He talked about the hotels like they were underperforming stock positions, and Clifton was a shareholder who needed to be educated on exit strategy. Clifton Pemberton stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of that meeting in under 20 minutes. Called his father that same afternoon and told him Maddox Capital was just another vulture fund with a prettier brochure. The exclusivity agreement collapsed. When Gabriel got the call, he was in his Manhattan office. He listened to the update without speaking. Put the phone down, sat in silence for approximately 90 seconds. Then he stood up, grabbed his coat, and told his assistant to get the jet ready. He wasn't going to Marblehead to strategize. He was going because 3 years of work had just been destroyed by a man on his own payroll, and the only person who might know how to salvage this was the woman whose strategy his COO had been too arrogant to follow. He landed after 9, drove straight to the Linden property, didn't call ahead. Walked through the lobby, took the stairs because the elevator was too slow, reached her door, knocked once hard, no answer, knocked again, tried the handle, unlocked. He pushed the door open, already mid-sentence, voice tight enough to crack. The covenant strategy. Dale threw it out, led with the term sheet like I'm buying a parking garage. Clifton walked. 3 years, Phoebe. 3 years and my own COO couldn't follow a 12-page brief that you... And then he stopped. The suite was dim. One lamp on the side table, throwing warm amber light across the room like a secret it was trying to keep. The curtains were half drawn. The ocean outside was doing what the ocean always does at night in Marblehead. Pushing against the rocks with a patience that doesn't care about your deadlines or your billion-dollar deals. And there, in the armchair by the window, was Phoebe. She was wearing a soft gray robe. Her hair was down. Gabriel had never seen her hair down before. Every meeting, every video call, every email exchange, she had been the woman with the low bun and the structured blazer and the voice that could make a spreadsheet feel like scripture. But this wasn't that woman. Or maybe it was. Maybe it was all of her, the version she'd been hiding underneath the one she showed the world. Auburn curls fell past her shoulders. Her feet were bare and tucked underneath her, and in her arms, cradled against her chest, was a baby. Tiny. Perfect. Eyes closed. One small fist curled around the fabric of her robe like he was holding on to the only safe thing in the universe. Phoebe was nursing him. She looked up at Gabriel standing in the doorway with his mouth open and his fury evaporating like steam off hot pavement. And the expression on her face was something he would think about for the rest of his life. There was no panic, no scramble to cover herself, no apology, no excuse, no flinch. Just a woman looking at a man with the quiet, immovable dignity of someone who has been holding the entire world together by herself and has decided, in this exact moment, that she is done pretending it isn't heavy. Gabriel didn't move. His briefcase was still in his hand. His coat was still on. The fury that had carried him across the sky and up those stairs was gone. Replaced by something he didn't have a word for. Not shock exactly. Something deeper. Something that felt like the ground shifting under his feet. Because his brain was doing the math. Fast. The way it always did. The late-night emails. The ones that came in at 1, 2, 3 in the morning. He'd assumed she was a workaholic. But she was also nursing a baby and then sitting down at her laptop because the work still had to get done. The family emergency in April. 10 days of silence. He'd barely noticed. Figured she had a parent in the hospital. Sent flowers and moved on. The video calls where she looked exhausted. where the lighting in her room seemed specifically arranged to hide the circles under her eyes, where she always had the camera angled just so, showing the desk and the wall behind her and nothing else. She had done all of it. Every page of that brand Bible, every strategy document, every competitive analysis, every subplan, including the one Dale had just thrown in the trash. She had done all of it while growing a human being inside her body and then keeping that human being alive on the outside. And she never said a word. "His name is Micah," Phoebe said. Her voice was steady. Not cold, not defensive, just clear. "He's 5 weeks old." Gabriel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "And before you say anything," she continued, adjusting Micah slightly against her chest, "every deliverable I've produced for you has been on time, on brief, and above standard. The work has never suffered. I made sure of that." She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't asking for understanding. She was stating facts the way a general states the position of troops on a map. "This is where things are. This is what I've done." The record speaks for itself. Gabriel stood there for what felt like a full minute. Micah made a small sound, a little exhale, the kind that newborns make when the world is warm enough and close enough and they don't need anything else. The room smelled like lavender and baby powder and something Gabriel couldn't name. Something that had nothing to do with deals or strategies or the wreckage of the Pemberton meeting. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, set the briefcase on the floor, unbuttoned his coat but didn't take it off, like he'd forgotten how clothes work, and then he asked a question that surprised both of them. "Are you okay?" Phoebe's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies where someone collapses into tears and the music swells. It was smaller than that. A microfracture. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes got bright. She looked down at Micah, pressed her lips together and nodded. "I'm managing," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. And what she saw wasn't the billionaire. Wasn't the CEO with the sharp jaw and the controlled voice and the private jet. She saw a man who had just walked through a door expecting a war room and found a nursery instead. And instead of retreating, instead of recalculating, instead of asking the obvious business questions like, "Why didn't you tell me?" or "How does this affect the timeline?" he asked if she was okay. Nobody had asked her that in months. Not really. Not in a way that meant it. "The father isn't in the picture," she said quietly. Not because he asked, but because something about the way he was sitting there, coat still on, briefcase on the floor, not rushing her, not performing concern but actually showing it, made her want to give him something honest. "He's the reason I left Harcourt. Not the way you think. He was the one who stole the money. My fiancé. The man I was supposed to marry. He took $6 million and disappeared with a woman I trained." Gabriel's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something behind them shifted. "I found out I was pregnant 2 days after I found out what he'd done," Phoebe continued. "He doesn't know about Micah. He'll never know. I made that decision and I stand by it." She paused. Micah had fallen asleep, his small body rising and falling with the rhythm of breathing that hasn't learned to be anxious yet. "When you called me, I was 5 months along. I should have told you. I know that. But your offer was the first door that had opened in over a year, and I couldn't afford to watch it close because someone looked at me and saw a liability instead of a strategist." The room was quiet. Outside, the ocean kept pushing against the rocks. "I'm telling you now," she said, "because I'm too tired to keep carrying this by myself, and because you just flew across the state to talk strategy with me at 10 o'clock at night, and you deserve to know who you're actually working with." Gabriel leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, looked at the floor for a long moment, then back at her. "My mother raised me and my sister alone," he said. "Cleaned offices at night, baked pound cakes to pay for my school. Did all of it without ever asking for help because she didn't think help was available." He paused, swallowed something that might have been emotion, might have been memory. "She died before she ever got to see what she built. 3 months before my first fund closed. And I've spent every day since then wishing I'd paid closer attention to what it cost her." He looked at Micah, then at Phoebe. "You built a 120-page brand Bible that's the best strategic work I've seen in 15 years of doing this. You built it while raising a newborn, alone, in a hotel suite, and you never missed a deadline. His voice was low, not soft exactly but stripped down. No performance, no boardroom polish. Don't ever apologize for that. To me or to anyone. Something passed between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet. Something more foundational. Recognition. The recognition of one person who carries everything alone looking at another person who does the same thing and thinking, "Oh, you too." They sat in that silence for a while. And then, because they were both who they were, because the world doesn't stop burning just because you've had a human moment, they got to work. Phoebe laid Micah in the bassinet beside the armchair. The baby slept with the terrifying peace of someone who has no idea how complicated the world is yet. And at the small desk by the window, with the lamp between them and the ocean outside, Gabriel and Phoebe rebuilt the Pemberton strategy from scratch. Not the way it usually worked. Not Gabriel directing and Phoebe executing. This was different. She challenged his instincts, told him flat out when an idea was wrong. He pushed back on her assumptions, asked questions that made her sharpen her thinking in real time. They argued about the preservation covenant, about whether Clifton could be brought back to the table or whether they needed to go over his head to Howard directly, about whether honesty was a viable strategy when the entire game was built on positioning and leverage. By 2 in the morning they had a new framework. Not a plan yet, a skeleton, but it was strong, it was honest, and it was theirs. Gabriel left at 2:30, walked through the quiet hotel lobby with his coat unbuttoned and his briefcase feeling lighter than it had in months. Not because the deal was saved. It wasn't. Not yet. But because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had sat across from someone who saw him clearly and hadn't flinched. And he'd done the same for her. He drove back to the hotel where he was staying, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for 20 minutes. Then he called Yolanda. "I met the baby," he said. Yolanda was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Told you she was special. You didn't tell me she had a kid." "I didn't know she had a kid. But I knew she was carrying something heavier than a brand strategy." You could hear it in her voice. Gabriel rubbed his face. "The deal is still falling apart. Then fix it. It's not that simple. Gabe, you called me at 2 in the morning, which means something shifted tonight that has nothing to do with the deal. So let me ask you the question you're not asking yourself. What are you actually afraid of losing here?" He didn't answer, but they both knew. The next morning, something happened that blew the Pemberton deal wide open, and it didn't come from the outside. Came from the inside. From a man Gabriel had trusted for almost a decade. Dale Whitfield had been stewing since the Clifton meeting fell apart. Gabriel's fury had been directed at him, and Dale knew it. He also knew that Gabriel had gone straight to Marblehead afterward, straight to Phoebe, the consultant Dale had argued against hiring from the beginning. The woman whose strategy he'd ignored was now the person Gabriel was turning to, and Dale felt his position shrinking in real time. So he did what insecure men do when they feel their grip slipping. He went looking for ammunition. Dale made calls, pulled threads. Within 48 hours, he had the full picture. The pregnancy, Micah, the timeline that proved Phoebe had been hiding a newborn for the entire duration of her contract. And underneath all of that, the connection to Marcus Webb, the Harcourt scandal, the embezzlement. Dale didn't care that Phoebe had been cleared. He cared that the information existed and that it could be weaponized. His plan was surgical. Leak everything to Pemberton's legal team. Let them discover that Maddox Capital's lead strategist was a woman connected to a major corporate fraud scandal who had been secretly raising a baby while building their pitch. It wouldn't matter that she was innocent. It wouldn't matter that the work was brilliant. The perception alone would be enough to make Howard Pemberton walk away. And once the deal collapsed, Gabriel's trust in Phoebe would look like poor judgment. Dale's position would be restored. Order would return. He almost got away with it. But Yolanda Maddox had spent years building relationships across the philanthropic and business worlds. And one of those relationships was with a woman who worked at the law firm representing the Pemberton Trust. Over coffee on a Tuesday morning, the woman mentioned, casually, that someone from Maddox Capital had been making inquiries about a consultant named Calloway. Background stuff. Sounded routine. It wasn't routine. Yolanda knew it the second she heard it. She called Gabriel within the hour. Laid it out. Dale's inquiries. The law firm connection. What it meant. Gabriel went cold. Not angry cold. Something worse. The quiet cold of a man who has just discovered that the person guarding his back has been sharpening a knife. He called Dale into his office. Closed the door. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Did you contact Pemberton's legal team about Phoebe Calloway? Dale hesitated 1 second too long. I was doing due diligence. Protecting the firms. Did you contact them? Gabriel, her background is a liability that you refuse to. Pack your desk. Legal will send the separation agreement by end of day. We're done. Dale stared at him. You're firing me. Over her. Gabriel looked at him with an expression that made Dale take a half step backward. I'm firing you because you sabotaged a deal to protect your ego. That's reason enough. But since you brought her up... Yeah, over her too. Because she built a strategy good enough to close this deal, and you were too small to follow it. Dale was gone by noon, but the damage wasn't contained. If Dale's inquiries had reached Pemberton's lawyers, the information was already in the building. It was only a matter of time before it found its way to Howard. Gabriel sat in his office that evening and faced a choice. He could bury it, hope the inquiries went nowhere, control the narrative, manage the optics, or he could tell the truth. He called Phoebe, told her what Dale had done, told her the information might already be in Pemberton's camp. The line was quiet for a long time. When Phoebe spoke, her voice was steady, the way it always was when things got bad. Bury it, she said. I've survived worse than exposure. Just get the deal done. Gabriel looked at his desk, at the framed photo of his mother, at the composition notebook sitting on the shelf behind him, the one with the someday places pasted inside. The whole point of your brand strategy, he said, is that these hotels deserve an owner who tells the truth about what they are. If I lie about who you are to win that argument, I've already lost it. Phoebe didn't respond for a moment. Then, so quiet he almost missed it. You don't have to do this. Yeah, Gabriel said. I do. He picked up the phone and dialed Howard Pemberton directly. Howard Pemberton picked up on the third ring. His voice was what you'd expect from a man who'd spent 50 years building something beautiful and watching it slowly fall apart. Low, a little rough around the edges. Patient in the way that only people who've been through real loss can be patient, because they already know that rushing doesn't change the outcome. Mr. Maddox, he said, it's late for a business call. It is, Gabriel replied. And this isn't a business call. Not exactly. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that means the other person is deciding whether to hang up or lean in. Howard leaned in. I'm listening. Gabriel had rehearsed this in his head for about 45 seconds before dialing. That was all the time he had. And in those 45 seconds, he made a decision that went against every instinct he'd built over 15 years of doing deals. He decided to skip the pitch, skip the positioning, skip the language that men in his world used to make ugly things sound reasonable. He just told the truth. The lead strategist on this deal is a woman named Phoebe Calloway, he began. She used to be VP of brand strategy at Harcourt Luxury Group. About 18 months ago, her fiancé, who was the CFO, was caught embezzling over $6 million from the company. He disappeared. She was investigated. She was fully cleared. Not a single connection to the fraud. Gabriel paused. Let that land. But in this industry, cleared doesn't erase the stain. She lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her future. All of it. Gone. Because the man she trusted turned out to be someone else entirely. Howard was quiet. Gabriel continued. I hired her because she's the best in the business. I stand by that. The brand strategy she built for your properties is the most compelling work I've seen in my career, and I've sat across from a lot of smart people. But there's more. He took a breath. This was the part that mattered. When Phoebe signed on to this project, she was 5 months pregnant. She didn't tell me. She couldn't afford to, because my offer was the first door that had opened for her in over a year, and she was terrified that if I knew, I'd close it. She moved into your Marblehead property, worked 16-hour days, built that entire brand Bible, and gave birth to a baby boy 5 weeks ago. His name is Micah. Gabriel heard something on the other end of the line. A shift, a small intake of breath. She's been doing all of it alone, Howard. Every strategy document, every competitive analysis, every subplan, including the preservation covenant that my own COO was too arrogant to present to your son the way she instructed. She built it while raising a newborn in a hotel suite with no help except a retired nurse from the town. And she never missed a single deadline. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out. Gabriel led it. I'm telling you this, he said, because someone on my team tried to leak this information to your lawyers to sabotage the deal and discredit her. That person has been fired. But the information is out there now, and I would rather you hear it from me, the full truth with nothing hidden, than find out from someone who wants to use it as a weapon. He paused one more time. You told me when we first met that you'd never sell these hotels to someone who wasn't honest about who they are. Well, this is who we are. My strategist is a woman who was betrayed by the person she loved most, lost her entire career because of it, rebuilt herself from nothing while carrying a child, and produced work that I believe will save your legacy. If that's a liability in your eyes, then we're not the right buyer. But I don't think it is. The line was quiet for so long that Gabriel thought Howard might have hung up. Then the old man spoke. My wife, Margaret, Howard said slowly, ran the kitchen of our first hotel, the one in Marblehead, the same property your strategist is sitting in right now. His voice had changed, softer, like he was reaching back through decades to touch something that still mattered. She was 8 months pregnant with Clifton at the time. We couldn't afford a chef. Couldn't afford much of anything, if I'm being honest. Margaret cooked breakfast for 20 guests every morning, managed the housekeeping staff, balanced the books at night, and never once complained. Not because she didn't have reason to, but because she believed in what we were building more than she believed in her own exhaustion. Howard paused. Gabriel could hear him breathing. The best people I've ever worked with, Howard continued, are the ones who carried more than anyone knew and never used it as an excuse. That's not a liability, Mr. Maddox. That's the only qualification that matters. He cleared his throat. You'll have your meeting. Final round. 2 weeks from Thursday. And I want her in the room. Not behind the scenes. In the room. Gabriel closed his eyes. Thank you, Howard. Don't thank me yet. You still have to convince me the numbers work. But the character question, you just answered that. The call ended. Gabriel sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, phone still in his hand, staring at the wall. His heart was doing something it hadn't done in years. It was beating fast. Not from fear. Not from the adrenaline of a deal. From something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. He called Phoebe. He said yes, Gabriel told her. Final round. 2 weeks. And he wants you presenting. Not me. You. The silence on her end was different from Howard's. The silence had tears in it. He wants me in the room, she repeated. In the room. Front and center. His words. Phoebe didn't speak for a moment. Gabriel heard Micah fussing softly in the background, and then the sound of her soothing him, that automatic rhythm of shushing and swaying that mothers do without thinking, even while the rest of their world is rearranging itself. Then I'd better make it count, she said. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation unlike anything either of them had experienced. Gabriel moved his operation to Marblehead, set up a temporary office in one of the hotel's unused conference rooms, brought in a small team, people he trusted, to handle logistics, financial modeling, legal review. But the core of the pitch, the story, the vision, the thing that would either win Howard Pemberton's legacy or lose it forever, that was Phoebe's. She worked differently now. Not the frantic, hidden, middle-of-the-night scramble of the previous months. This was focused, purposeful. She worked in concentrated bursts during the hours June was with Micah, and she stopped when she needed to stop. Not because the urgency had decreased, but because something had shifted in the way she was carrying it. She wasn't alone anymore, and that changed the math. Gabriel helped in ways that had nothing to do with the pitch. He had groceries delivered to her suite without saying anything about it. He adjusted the meeting schedule so her mornings were free until 9, because that was when Micah was happiest, and Phoebe had mentioned once, in passing, that those morning hours were the only time she felt like a real mother instead of a person performing triage. He asked June, quietly and without making a production of it, if Phoebe was sleeping enough. More than before, June said, giving him a look that contained about 40 years of wisdom packed into 3 seconds of eye contact. But not enough. She's stubborn. I noticed. Good. Keep noticing. Phoebe noticed the groceries, the adjusted schedule, the fact that Gabriel never once brought up Micah in a professional context, never treated the baby as a complication or a variable to be managed. He treated Micah like a fact, like the sky being blue, not remarkable, just real, and it terrified her, because the last man who'd gotten close enough to see the real Phoebe had used what he saw to destroy her. Marcus hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen her ability to trust proximity. Every time someone got close now, every nerve in her body screamed the same warning. This is how it starts. They see you, they learn you, and then they use it. She caught herself pulling back, keeping Gabriel at professional distance even as the work demanded closeness, being crisper in emails than she needed to be, declining his suggestion that they grab dinner after a late session with a practiced excuse about needing to relieve June. June saw it. Of course June saw it. June had raised 4 children, buried a husband, survived a cancer scare, and worked in a hospital for 30 years. Very little about human behavior surprised her anymore. Can I say something? June asked one evening while Phoebe was feeding Micah in the rocking chair by the window. You're going to say it whether I give permission or not, Phoebe replied, a tired smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. That man has rearranged his entire professional life to be in this building for the last 10 days. He sends food to your door like he thinks you'll forget to eat, which honestly you would. He adjusts his schedule around your baby's mornings. And not once, not a single time has he asked for anything in return. Not even a thank you. Phoebe looked at the ceiling. June, I'm not finished. I watched you with Marcus. I wasn't there, but I can see the scars. That man took your trust and snapped it like a twig. I understand why you flinch. But honey, not every man who sees you is trying to take something. Some people just want to help carry the weight, and you are allowed to let them. Phoebe didn't respond. She looked down at Micah, who was staring up at her with those wide, unfocused eyes that newborns have, like they're seeing something the rest of us have forgotten. I don't know how to do that anymore, she said quietly. Let someone in. Nobody does, June replied. You just do it anyway and see what happens. The day of the pitch arrived like weather. You could feel it coming, and then it was there. The meeting was held in the Marblehead Properties' original dining room, a beautiful space with wide plank floors and tall windows overlooking the harbor. Howard Pemberton sat at the head of a long oak table that had probably hosted 1,000 meals over the last century. Clifton sat beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. 2 lawyers flanked them. A financial advisor hovered near the window. Gabriel's team took the other side. But when it came time for the presentation, Gabriel did something that made every person in that room recalibrate. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said, I'm going to hand the floor to Phoebe Calloway. She built this strategy. She should be the one to present it. Then he sat down. Phoebe stood. She was wearing a navy blazer over a white blouse, hair in the low bun, no notes in her hand. She'd memorized every word, every number, every transition, because she knew that the moment she looked down at a page, she'd lose the room. She didn't look down once. She talked about the Linden collection the way Howard Pemberton talked about it. Not as properties, as promises. She showed them what each hotel had been, what it was now, and what it could become. She walked through the preservation strategy, the guest experience redesign, the marketing repositioning, each piece building on the last like stones in an arch. She addressed Clifton directly, looked him in the eye and acknowledged what he was afraid of losing. Showed him the advisory structure, the naming rights, the legacy protections. She didn't condescend. She didn't perform. She spoke to him like a partner, not a problem. And then she did something that wasn't in the deck. She told Howard about the guest books. "I've been living in your Marblehead property for 5 months," she said. "And one of the first things I did was read the guest books. They go back decades. Handwritten entries from people who stayed here on their honeymoons. Families who came back every summer for 20 years. A woman who wrote in 1987 that this hotel was where she first felt like herself." She paused. "Let the room breathe. That's not a brand, Mr. Pemberton. That's a covenant. Between you and every person who ever walked through your doors and felt something they couldn't get anywhere else. What I'm proposing isn't a new direction. It's a renewal of that covenant. With better infrastructure, smarter marketing, and the financial backing to make sure these places are still standing when your grandchildren bring their grandchildren." The room was quiet. Howard Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed his chair back, stood up slowly, the way men in their late 70s stand when they want you to know the gesture is deliberate. He walked around the table, stopped in front of Phoebe, extended his hand. "You understand what these places are," he said. "That's all I needed to know." Phoebe shook his hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were bright. And behind her, Gabriel Maddox was sitting in his chair, watching the woman who had just saved his deal and broken something open inside him that he wasn't sure he knew how to close. The room exhaled. Clifton uncrossed his arms. The lawyers started talking details. And just like that, the thing that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago became real. The Linden deal was closing. In the hallway outside the dining room, June Hargrove was sitting on a bench with Micah asleep against her shoulder. She'd been there the entire time. Not because Phoebe asked her to be, but because June understood that some moments in life need a witness, even if the witness is a retired nurse holding a baby in a hallway. When Phoebe came through the doors, she walked straight to June, took Micah into her arms, held him against her chest, his warm weight settling into her like an anchor finding the ocean floor. "How'd it go?" June asked, though the answer was already on Phoebe's face. Phoebe smiled, a real one. The kind that starts slow and takes over everything. "He shook my hand," she said. "He stood up and he shook my hand." June nodded, patted Phoebe's arm. "About time somebody did." The contracts took 3 weeks to finalize. Lawyers on both sides going back and forth over language that would make your eyes glaze over. Indemnification clauses, transfer schedules, preservation covenants with enough specificity to satisfy Clifton Pemberton's need to feel like he was still holding the wheel even though the car had already changed drivers. But the hard part was over. The trust was built. The handshake was real. And on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, in a conference room at Howard Pemberton's law firm in Boston, Gabriel Maddox signed the documents that made the Linden collection his. His hand didn't shake, but his chest did something strange when the pen touched paper. A tightness that wasn't anxiety, wasn't fear. It was the feeling of a promise kept to someone who wasn't in the room. Yolanda flew in for the signing. She stood in the back, arms crossed, smiling like a woman who had been right about something important and was exercising enormous restraint by not saying "I told you so" out loud. Howard Pemberton stayed after the lawyers cleared out, shook Gabriel's hand one more time, held it longer than protocol required. "Take care of them," the old man said, and Gabriel understood he wasn't talking about the hotels. There was champagne afterward. Gabriel's team filled a private dining room at a restaurant near the waterfront. Toasts were made. Numbers were celebrated. Someone ordered a second bottle, then a third. But the moment that mattered happened later. Gabriel found Phoebe on the back porch of the Marblehead property at sunset. She was sitting on the top step, Micah in her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket that June had knitted during the final weeks of preparation. The sky over the harbor was doing that thing it does in late May in New England, turning orange and pink and purple all at once, like it can't decide which version of beautiful to commit to. Phoebe heard him come through the door but didn't turn around. He sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough to matter. For a while, neither of them said anything. The ocean was making its noise. Micah was making his. and the space between the two people on that porch was filled with something that didn't need words yet. "You know what my mother would have called this place?" Gabriel said finally. Phoebe looked at him. "A someday place." He stared out at the water. She had a notebook full of them, pictures torn out of magazines, hotels and inns and places she'd never been. She'd write "someday" underneath each one like it was a prayer. He paused. "She never made it to any of them, and I spent 10 years buying properties like these, telling myself I was honoring her dream. But the truth is, I was just filling a hole, buying the buildings she would have loved and keeping them at arm's length. Same way I keep everything at arm's length." He turned to Phoebe. The sunset was on her face. Micah's eyes were open, staring at the sky with the bewildered focus of a baby discovering that the world has colors. "I don't want to do that anymore," Gabriel said. Phoebe held his gaze. There was a war happening behind her eyes. He could see it. The part of her that wanted to lean in fighting the part that remembered what happened the last time she leaned in. "Gabriel," she said carefully, "I have a 6-week-old baby. I have a career that's held together with tape and prayer. I have an ex-fiancé who stole millions and fled the country. I'm not the simple option here. I didn't ask for the simple option. I know. But I need you to understand what you're walking into, because I can survive a lot of things. I've proven that. But I cannot survive being seen by someone again and then abandoned. I'm not built for that. Not anymore." The honesty of it sat between them like something physical. Gabriel didn't rush to fill the silence. He sat with it, let it breathe, because he understood, maybe for the first time, that this woman wasn't asking for promises. She was asking for proof. And proof takes time. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "But I know that doesn't mean anything yet. So I'm going to show you instead of telling you. And you can take as long as you need." Phoebe looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Micah. Then back at the ocean. "Okay," she said quietly. "Show me." And he did. Not with grand gestures. Gabriel Maddox was many things, but a man who did grand romantic gestures was not one of them. He showed her the way his mother had shown him. Through the small things. The ones that cost attention instead of money. In the weeks after the deal closed, while the transition team began the massive work of taking over the Linden properties, Gabriel did things that nobody on his payroll would have believed if they'd seen them. He adjusted his travel schedule so he was in Marblehead 3 days a week instead of 1. Not announced. Not performative. He just showed up. Brought coffee in the morning. Sat in the conference room working on his own deals while Phoebe worked on the brand transition plan. Both of them in a comfortable silence that didn't need filling. He learned Micah's schedule. Figured out that the baby was fussiest between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, which Phoebe called the witching hours with the dark humor of a woman running on limited sleep. Gabriel started appearing at 4 with takeout and a calm presence, holding Micah against his chest while Phoebe ate a meal with both hands for the first time all day. The first time he held Micah, he looked like a man trying to defuse a bomb. Stiff arms. Rigid posture. The expression of someone who has successfully negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions but is genuinely uncertain about a 7-pound human being. "Support his head," Phoebe said, adjusting his hands. "I am supporting his head. You're supporting his neck. His head is the part above the neck. This is harder than a leveraged buyout. Most important things are." Micah settled against Gabriel's chest, grabbed a fistful of his shirt, and fell asleep in under 3 minutes. Gabriel looked down at the baby, then up at Phoebe, and the expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was wonder. The specific wonder of a man who has spent his entire adult life building things out of numbers and strategy, discovering that the most extraordinary thing in the world weighs 7 pounds and smells like baby powder. "He's got a strong grip," Gabriel said. "He gets that from me," Phoebe replied. "I believe it." June watched all of this from a respectful distance. She had been watching since the night Gabriel first walked through that door, and she had opinions, but she was wise enough to keep most of them to herself. Most of them. One afternoon, while Gabriel was on a call in the other room and Phoebe was reviewing property renovation plans, June sat down across from her and folded her hands on the table. You're still holding your breath, June said. Phoebe looked up. What? Around him. You're still holding your breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I can see it in your shoulders. Phoebe put down her pen. June, it's been 2 months. Exactly. It's been 2 months and that man has shown up every single week. He holds your baby like Micah is made of crystal. He sends groceries without mentioning it. He fired his own COO to protect you. And you're still bracing for impact. Phoebe looked at the table. You make it sound unreasonable. I make it sound human. But here's the thing, honey. You survived Marcus Webb. You survived losing your career. You survived pregnancy alone. You survived building a masterpiece of a pitch on no sleep with a newborn. You have survived everything life has thrown at you. But surviving and living aren't the same thing. And at some point you have to decide which one you're doing. Phoebe didn't respond right away. She sat with it the way she sat with all important things, quietly, completely, letting it settle into the place where decisions get made. That night, after June had gone home and Micah was asleep in his crib, Phoebe picked up the phone and called Gabriel. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. I'm not managing. I haven't been managing for a long time. I've been surviving. And there's a difference. And she paused, pressed her hand against her forehead. I don't want to just survive anymore. And I don't want to do this alone. Any of it. The line was quiet. She could hear him breathing. You don't have to, Gabriel said. Simple as that. No speech. No declaration. Just 4 words that meant everything because they came from a man who had spent his whole life keeping people at arm's length and was choosing, for the first time, to close the distance. 18 months later, the Linden Collection's flagship property in Marblehead reopened after a full renovation. The bones were the same. The wide plank floors, the tall windows, the wraparound porch that looked out over the harbor like a promise that the view would always be worth the climb. But everything else was transformed. Not in the flashy, unrecognizable way that luxury renovations usually go. In a way that felt like the building had taken a deep breath and finally relaxed. Updated rooms that still felt like rooms, not showpieces. A restaurant that used local ingredients and didn't require a translator to read the menu. A lobby where the guest books, the original ones going back decades, were displayed in a glass case near the entrance because Phoebe insisted that the history was the brand and the brand was the history. The reopening party was held on a Saturday evening in September. Howard Pemberton came, 80 years old now, moving slower, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He walked through the lobby, touching the walls the way you touch something you thought you'd lost and can't believe you're holding again. Clifton came too, still stiff, still guarded, but he shook Phoebe's hand without being prompted, which was progress. Yolanda was there, obviously, telling anyone who would listen that she had introduced Gabriel and Phoebe, which was technically true if you defined introduced, as mentioned her name in a meeting and then let fate do the rest. I'm basically a matchmaker, Yolanda told a waiter who had not asked. You mentioned her name one time, Gabriel said, passing by with 2 glasses of champagne. And look what happened. One time was enough. You're welcome. Micah was there too, walking now. Toddling, really, with that unsteady determination that toddlers have, like they've just discovered that legs exist and they're furious they didn't get the memo sooner. He moved through the lobby like he owned the place, which, in a manner of speaking, he sort of did. The staff adored him. The concierge kept a basket of animal crackers behind the desk specifically for Micah's visits. The head chef had learned to make a pasta so plain it bordered on philosophical because it was the only thing Micah would eat without protest. Gabriel and Phoebe were together. Not in a tabloid way. Not in a press release way. In the way that actually matters. Mornings and meals. Arguments about paint colors that went on longer than either of them would admit. Late-night conversations on that back porch where neither person was performing for the other. They didn't live together yet. Phoebe had moved into a house in Marblehead. A real house with a yard and a kitchen that smelled like coffee in the morning and baby food in the evening. Gabriel kept his apartment in Manhattan but spent most weeks in Marblehead. And his assistant had stopped asking whether to book him a hotel because the answer was always the same. Phoebe was the permanent chief brand officer of the Linden Collection. Not a consultant. Not a contractor. A partner with equity and a seat at the table and her name on the door. She had rebuilt her career not by erasing what happened to her, but by proving that what happened to her was never the most important thing about her. June Hargrove still came by 3 days a week. Not because Phoebe needed a full-time caregiver anymore, but because June had become family. The kind of family you choose. The kind that shows up with soup and opinions and doesn't leave when the crisis is over. And in Gabriel's office, on the shelf behind his desk, next to his mother's composition notebook with the someday places pasted inside, there was a framed photograph. It was from the night the deal closed. Phoebe on the back porch of the Marblehead property. Micah in her arms. The sunset behind them doing that thing where it turns every color at once. Not a magazine clipping. Not a someday place. A right now place. A home. Gabriel looked at that photograph every morning when he sat down at his desk. And every morning, he thought about his mother's notebook. About the places she dreamed of visiting and never reached. About the woman who cleaned offices at night so her son could build an empire. And he thought about what Lorraine had told him in that apartment, 2 a.m, for days before she died. You're going to do big things, baby. Just don't do them alone. Took him almost a decade. But he finally listened. Now, I want to talk to you for a second. Not about Gabriel and Phoebe. About you. The story has a lot of layers. The deal. The baby. The betrayal. The second chance. But if you peel all of that away, what's underneath is something pretty simple. We build walls to protect ourselves. And most of the time, those walls do their job. They keep the bad stuff out. The people who would hurt us. The risks that feel too dangerous. The vulnerability that once cost us everything. But here's what nobody tells you about walls. They don't just keep bad things out. They keep good things out too. And if you live behind them long enough, you start to forget that there's a difference. Phoebe didn't need Gabriel to save her. Let's be clear about that. She had already saved herself. Multiple times. She survived Marcus. Survived the scandal. Survived raising a baby alone while building a career from scratch. That woman was not waiting for a rescue. What Gabriel gave her wasn't rescue. It was witness. He saw her. The real her. Not the resume. Not the scandal. Not the single mother struggling to hold it together. He saw all of it, the mess and the brilliance and the exhaustion and the strength, and he didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix her. He just stayed. And that changed everything. Not because she was weak, but because being truly seen by someone who stays, that's the kind of strength you can't build alone, no matter how capable you are. So here's my question, and I mean this one. Who's on the other side of your wall right now? Who's been showing up, quietly, consistently, not asking for anything, just there? And what would happen if you let them in? I don't know your situation. I don't know your wall. But I know this. The thing you're protecting yourself from might not be the thing you should be afraid of. Sometimes the bigger risk isn't letting someone in. It's keeping them out so long that they stop trying. Now I've got one more question, and this one's for the comments. Phoebe never told Marcus about Micah. He doesn't know he has a son. As far as Phoebe's concerned, that door is closed and locked and buried under concrete. But Micah is getting older, and someday that boy is going to ask about his father. And Phoebe is going to have to decide what to say. Does she tell him the truth? All of it? The embezzlement, the betrayal, the disappearance? Or does she protect him from it and give him a softer version? And what about Marcus? Does he have a right to know his son exists, even after everything he did? What would you do? Because I genuinely don't know the right answer on this one. Drop it in the comments. I'm reading every single one. And if the story resonates with you, if it made you think about the walls you've built or the people you've been keeping at arm's length or the someday places you keep putting off, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories coming that I think you need to hear. Until next time.